Thank you very much for your kind introduction. If you studied Debrett's, you would find that it should be the other way round. It's Canon, Councillor, because the religious title takes precedence, because they'll only take that away from me if I do something very naughty with a choir boy. But the councillor role is only until the people of North Woolwich decide they don't want me as their councillor anymore. So, but two very interesting roles, lots of similarities, of course. I always feel that being a councillor is very similar to being a parish priest, in that I'm signposting people, I'm listening to people. I can't tell you the number of people who've said to me over these past, I've been a councillor 9 years now, I can't tell you the number of people who've said to me, you're the first person who's actually listened to me. And of course, that's such an important role, listening to each other. So, I met my husband at the visit of a new bishop's house in Chelmsford Diocese. They bought a new house and they wanted clergy to come and visit it and see what it was like. They were obviously rather proud of it and they wanted us to go and see. So I went with my colleagues from the parish where I worked at the time in Stratford, not on Avon, Stratford East, Newham, and I went with my colleagues and we had a very nice time and stood around chatting with people. We saw around the house and beautiful gardens just outside Chelmsford. And we were standing there waiting to go, really. You know how you do, oh dear, who's going to be first to leave, you know. So we thought, well, we'll just stand here. And as we were standing there, my colleague, who was chaplain to University of East London, said, oh, look, there's Christopher. Christopher, hi. And, of course, the Church of England is a very small world, really. And they had worked together in Portsmouth. And, oh, come over here. Oh, meet my colleagues. Here's this one. And we stood around and chatted, as you do. And then it was time to go. And my colleague looked, he had a very, very expensive camera. And he looked at his camera and said, oh, look, I've just got a couple of films left. Come on, look, you two, bride and groom, click. And, of course, everybody roared with laughter because we'd literally met each other for 5 minutes. But, of course, that photograph takes pride of place in our home, as you can imagine. So what did we do once we got together? I knew, I think, the moment he held my arm while the photograph was being taken, and I knew then it took him, gentlemen, another 4.5 years. But never mind, we got there in the end. So how do we make relationships? Well, of course, we make them between faiths the same as we make them between people. What did we do? We did things together. We went out together. It was important to see if he was kind to people while we were out, if he was pleasant and polite. And also, we listened to each other. We talked about what was important. We talked about our families and where we'd come from. And I have to say, I'm very much a Newham girl, born and bred, while he's posh. Daddy was a university lecturer at Cambridge, so a long way, you know, they had au pairs and 2 cars and foreign holidays before I even knew such a thing existed. But there, so we found out about each other, and that's how relationships develop. We listen, we learn, we share. And in Newham, which is an East London borough, quite poor, not the poorest borough in the country nowadays, because we've had a little bit of gentrification thanks to the people who can't afford to live in Hackney. but live in Newham instead because it's fairly near. We are about 340,000, of whom 40% of us are under 25. So a very young borough, lots of people around. It's very buzzy, Newham. It's very sort of exciting. It feels there's any hour of the day and night, there's things happening, there's people moving, there's traffic going, there's always something going on. And the lovely thing that there's lots of lovely things about Newham, but one that I particularly love is the fact that almost everybody has a faith. It's very normal in Newham to have a faith, you know. In fact, it would be quite the opposite. If they said, well, what faith are you? And you said, well, I don't really have one. They would, well, why? You know, that's very peculiar. Why don't you have a faith? So and the Christians at the last census were about 100 more than the Muslims. So we're together about the same sort of number of people from all over the world in Newham, and so all sorts of different Christians, Romanian Orthodox, Greek Orthodox, Church of England, all sorts of Protestant churches, so Methodists, Baptists, Congregationalists and so on, all sorts of different brands of Islam, but of course next to that, Sikhism, Hinduism, all sorts, Buddhism, Jains. I think somebody described themselves in the census as being a Star Trek person. So, well, okay, which seems a bit wild, but there you are. If that's what they think they are, fair enough. And what we do with the Faith Forum is to listen, to learn, to share. It was formed when the mayor asked me, we have a Muslim mayor, a woman, Roxana Fiaz, who's a great person, and I think you ought to get her to come and talk one day because she comes from a very interesting background, brought over by parents from Bangladesh, I think, and who set up home here. She went to school locally and worked locally and everything. So she decided that we would have this role, the Commissioner for Interfaith Engagement, and invited me as one of her 66 councillors, of whom, just tell you this in brackets, 63 are Labour. We did have, it was 100% until a couple of years ago, but the Greens elbowed their way in, and so that's good, interesting. If I would take on that role, and it was great, and we had a wonderful interfaith supper, and everybody came out saying how wonderful it was, and this was 2019. So we just got things going when, of course, the great lockdown happened and COVID came. And we were so glad that we had begun that network because, of course, it was very important. When you're a person of faith, congregating is something that I think we all do. We congregate. We have a group. Being part of a faith group is about being together with your fellow this or that, whatever you are. And so we could no longer congregate. What were we to do? How were we to keep our people safe? And we had endless Zooms. You're on mute, you know, oh dear, we still do it, don't we? We still do it. And discussing and working out, with the help from the local authority, how to keep our people safe. We talked, when it came along, thank God, about vaccination. Of course, there were very divided views about that, but it gave us the opportunity and the freedom to talk, to hear how other people viewed it, and to look at how we felt ourselves. Because, of course, when you hear the way somebody else does something, you might think, that's a really good idea, I'm going to do just the same as that. Or you might think, whoa, I'm not going to do that. I don't like the idea of that. Or somewhere in between. And that's the way the world goes. And so we had that. And then that laid the foundations for as the world gradually came out of lockdown and we were able to do other things. So I made a bit of a list of some of the subjects that we've talked about, particularly just recently in Interfaith Week. We've got something called the 50 Steps to Health. Newham, East Ham and West Ham on the district line. And it's a proven fact that the further you go along the district line, the longer you can be expected to live. Which is pretty dramatic, isn't it, really? Because if you live in Newham, the chances are the poverty, the poor air quality, the lack of so very much in the way of employment in all sorts of ways means that you statistically will die sooner than people who live in Upminster further down the line, which is a horrifying statistic, really. So we talked about health and how does faith impact health. And when we know that statistically belonging to a faith group is very good for our health, whatever the faith group is, it's good for your health to belong to a faith group. We talked about mental health, such an important point, and again, something that's very much in the news these days. And we talked about it particularly in respect of gambling. And we had somebody come along. Generally, the routine is that we have somebody who comes along and tells us some facts, set the scene, tells us some facts. And then we go into our table groups and we talk about that. And then we come back and have a plenary, and talk about it together. And one man, when we asked, well, what have you found out? What have you discovered? Said, right, we've got to ban gambling. That's the only thing. We'll make it illegal. We'll make it illegal. Well, of course, it was until not so very many years ago in this country. And it didn't help then. People still had runners on street corners. And the rich, who, let's face it, can do what they like so often, still had their horse racing and their polo matches and all the rest of it. But we talked about that. We talked about the place of women in faith. And if you were to ask me, what problems have I had around chairing the Faith Forum in Newham? One of them I would have said, and it doesn't usually come to me as a problem, is that I'm female. And that so often the people who come to our groups, the representatives, are male. And of course, I realise that's exactly what would have happened, I don't know, perhaps in my grandma's time, that if you'd had a meeting, an open meeting, it would have been the men from our congregation that would go and represent the church family or whatever there, because they tended to be the leaders. And so it's very important to me to talk about the place of women in faith. We ventured out a bit and talked about the end of life. Partly, very practically, because I understand that in some faiths, the feeling is that the end of one's life is down to one's creator. And that's all there is to it. So you mustn't prepare for it. You mustn't do anything, because who knows when it's going to be. And when it comes, that's it. You're out. Or wherever. And what people had found, and of course you're in the West, people who are ill go into hospital. where perhaps were they in their home country, they would have stayed at home and been looked after by the family. But people in the West tend to go into hospital. And so the nurse or the doctor says, right, have you talked about, things like do not resuscitate? And if actually your belief is that, you carry on until God says stop, you won't have discussed that. You may not have a will. In fact, in certain groups and faith groups, very unlikely that you'll have a will. So, of course, then there's going to be all sorts of fights and fisticuffs about who gets the good china and who gets the gold and who gets this and that, So that was very interesting. And then the second half of the evening, we talked about what happens after death. So where are we going? What's it going to be like? And that was fascinating to hear different people's views and ideas, different faiths, where they come from, depending on where they are, what might happen. We then got a bit confident, I think, after that, and decided that perhaps we could talk about something even more difficult. And we talked about sexuality and spirituality. Does my faith fit my way of being? Because we know that in certain faiths, things like homosexuality, women, all sorts of things are not permitted. And so we wanted to talk about that. And it was very interesting. Of course, it was at the very... We didn't get very deep, let's put it like that, because we were quite a big group. People wanted to ask questions of the faith reps that were there. So we didn't get as deep as we might have done had there been half a dozen of us sitting round a table. But 2 people separately came to me afterwards and said, I have never spoken about those 2 things in the same sentence. And yet how important. So much part of our identity, our faith and our sexuality, where we are. It means a lot. And I felt, well, perhaps, okay, we took a risk and it was not easy, but it was worthwhile if those 2 people, for the first time ever, had had that experience. So lots of different ideas. The Wolf Institute, which you may know about, part of Cambridge Theological Federation, came and looked at us for quite a while, for a year of our life, a couple of years ago, and used our experience, as it were, for the tools for interfaith work. They've done a report and a paper on interfaith work, and it's based on the Newham experience because they use that idea. So that's the Wolf Institute. Other people come and have a look at us and see how we do it. Of course, it's so easy. If your neighbour, where we live, the lady next door is Bengali Muslim. She's a childminder. She's fantastic. They're lovely, lovely family. Her son's just graduated as a doctor and she's absolutely so happy and proud. On the other side, we've got Turkish Muslims. Couldn't wish for better neighbours. Across the road, we've got Bengali Muslims and an Irish Catholic couple, Tom and Barbara. Further up, we've got a Hindu family. And a bit further down the road, we have a Sikh family, all of whom we know well. We look after each other. We keep an eye on each other. And so, in a sense, it's easy for us to do interfaith. Our children are brought up together, and I think that's such an important part of getting the right sort of feel. So all those ideas, that's what we do, that's what we talk about, and then we do things. And we did things like, on Saturday, we planted a tree for peace. And the thing about this is it's an Acer, which is not green. The leaves are red, with an Acer tree. We wanted something different and something that would stand out. But the thing about a tree, which was about, I suppose, that round when we planted it on Saturday, it will grow, they told us, to 40 feet, and it will last for about 350 years. It's very unlikely that any of the group of about 25 people of different faiths will be able to sit and luxuriate under its shade. But that's not why you plant a tree. You plant a tree so that your children and your grandchildren will be able to luxuriate in the shade of that tree. That's what it's about. We make peace, we make relationships, we share love so that the world will be a better place for our children and their children. Whether we have our own children or not, that's the important thing. We can't do everything in Newham, we don't do everything, but we try to do small things well. It's not an enormous group. Probably the largest we've had would be 60, 65 people, something like that, at some of our more popular discussions. And out of 340,000, that's not a huge percentage. But I hope that the ripples of that work go out and that people say, you know, because what they always say is, we have so much in common. We have so much in common. We listen, we learn, we share. Thank you very much.